Thanks very much for that. And look, as a Warramai man, I too would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which we gather here today, the Darkinjung people, and also pay respects to elders past and present. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I want to thank the Words on the Waves Festival for the invitation to come down and take part in a few panels. And I've attended this festival before, about 3 or 4 years ago, I think, which is a great festival. I like these smaller personal festivals, which are really good, and it's great to see the crowds turn out. Now, I'm really privileged to share the stage with two writers that I greatly admire, Kate Grenville and David Marr. So we'll get into that. Kate, of course, is one of Australia's most celebrated authors, having published 18 books, including The Secret River, The Lieutenant, Lillian's Story, and her latest book is Unsettled. David Marr has written for Fairfax and The Guardian and has appeared on the ABC programs Media Watch, Q&A and The Insiders. His many books include The Lives of Patrick White and Garfield Barwick, and his latest book is Killing for Country. To get started, these are both important and courageous books to undertake. Can you both describe what set you off in these family history journeys of discovery? And we'll start with you, Kate. Ladies first.
I was just turning to let David go first. Look, I've been circling this book all my life because my mother was quite progressive, and in 1963, when I was 12 or 13, she actually was one of the very first tourists to Uluru, which was then, of course, called Ayers Rock. I think it was only the second year that tourists could go there. And she brought back various things, including, I think very poignantly, a little matchbox full of red dirt. It's like she wanted to bring back a bit of the actual country. For her, it was an eye-opener, and she conveyed that to me. She told me about the red dirt, and she told me about the Aboriginal people who she'd met. So I think that kind of resonated, along with a lot of other things, right up until, there were so many things. But in the year 2000, I did the Walk for Reconciliation across the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which probably a few of you did as well. And that brought together the family stories about our convict ancestor and other ancestors that she'd always been telling me. And I suddenly realised that I'd been listening to those stories without great interest for my whole life. But it was time that I addressed what they meant, what it meant to be a white Australian, non-Indigenous Australian on stolen land. I probably didn't put it as clearly to myself as that. So I did a lot of research and wrote The Secret River, which was based on that convict ancestor. But 20 years later, having done a lot of research and work in that area, the referendum happened, and I suddenly realised that what had always been a private journey of exploration for me through my own personal family could have a public life in the wider world as a book. And so with great misgivings, I presented Unsettled as a work of kind of public truth-telling rather than private truth-finding.
David, what about yourself, and undertaking this family history project or journey?
Well, the first thing I have to make absolutely clear is that this story has got nothing to do with the Marrs. The Marrs are of impeccable honesty and decency. Scottish blacksmiths who came to this country and did okay. The problem is my mother's family.
It's always the mother.
A bunch of fantasists and misfits with some a lot of lies. My grandmother was a Wedgwood. She was a Wedgwood. And listen to her, and you would believe that we were direct descendants of the great Josiah. We are, in fact, direct descendants of the station master at Birmingham. But I have an uncle, still alive, 93 years old, an absolutely superb man, who decided to organise a family expedition to the Western Front to celebrate the centenary of the armistice, because his father, my grandfather, fought in the war. Now, you would imagine that a family expedition of that kind was being organised because my grandfather, his father, was perhaps a general. No, he wasn't. He was a howitzer gunner and a private, but nevertheless was actually fighting the day the war ended. So we went over as a family expedition and we had a wonderful time. So the following year he decided he wanted to do another expedition, and this time we would go on Anzac Day to the little dot on the map in New South Wales where his sort of family really comes from. It's a sort of a nothing spot on the map. And he said to me, look, you did all that searching, and me and my partner Sebastian Tesorero did a lot of searching for the war expedition. Could you find out something about the Ewer family, my grandmother's family? I know nothing about them. And he said, somebody has published a book about it, and I tracked down a copy of the book, and it's one of those hilarious family history things, the great purpose of which is to prove a close connection to the Dukes of Roxburgh, and full of absolute bullshit history and speculation on a wild scale about great connection, whereas in fact the family comes from the docks on the Thames. But anyway, in there, and about a quarter of an hour after I started looking, there was a photograph of my great-great-grandfather in the uniform of the native police. And I looked at this and I went, oh, fuck. I've been writing about race and politics in this country for 50 years. The first time I ever reported on this issue, 1974, working for the Bulletin, sent to Northern Queensland to investigate why Labor lost such an enormous number of votes between 1972 and 74, and the answer was because the Whitlam government was giving scholarships to Aboriginal kids to try to keep them in secondary schools. And that had enraged people in Northern Queensland, not entirely without reason, because equally poor families were not being given assistance because they were white. Black families were being given assistance because they were Indigenous. So that was and I had never thought in all of those 50 years to just have a bit of a look at my forebears and see whether there was any direct responsibility there. I thought for a wonderful moment, maybe I've always misunderstood what the native police were, and maybe they were a beneficial force, taking meals and care to Indigenous families in straitened circumstances. So I thought, I know, Google. I went straight to Google, and when you Google the Queensland Native Police, there you find my great-grandfather, because he was a notoriously brutal man, and as was his brother. And so I just knew, without any kind of decision-making, I just knew that I would now investigate that story.
Yeah. I have to tell you, David, did you do part-time skits as a comedian as well?
That's very kind of you, John, but it helps keep certain painful things at a distance.
Absolutely, absolutely. Why is it so important for the country to recognise and learn from hidden family histories, do you think? And everybody has these stories, and we need to have them told. So, why do you think it's so important that people undertake, the same sort of course as you guys have?
Look, I think, our leaders seem to have given up on any kind of truth-telling, so I think it's up to us to do what we can with what we've got. And those of us who are descended from those pioneers, we do have, if not stories, we know the genealogy. So we have to start there with where we are and what we've got. And it's important because it hasn't been done, basically. I mean, I grew up in the 1950s, went to school in the 50s and 60s, when Aboriginal people did not appear at all in the textbooks, except occasionally as a native guide, always called Jackie Jackie. And my education consisted of drawing, we had those plastic stencils of the map of Australia on which we drew different kinds of dotted lines to show the many hopeless explorers who went off into the desert. So it's time, I can only say. This is a huge silence in our culture, and it's time we filled it.
Look, I think if all of this work by historians and people writing about the frontier wars would have only one simple purpose, to just establish in our minds that we live in a conquered country. I've got myself some worries about the word stolen, but we live in a conquered country, and if we could just accept that, not with any great, howls of grief and guilt and rage, but just accept that we live in a conquered country, it reorders our obligations to those we conquered. And it also brings, I think, a measured and sensible understanding of the overwhelming forces of colonisation in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries around the world. And that's kind of the simple purpose. But one of the reasons to do it via family searching is because it is a way that we hope readers can follow us. There are many wonderful histories, really wonderful histories of frontier conflict. But when I set out, with my partner's help, Sebastian's help, to write this book, I was deliberately not covering all kinds of things. This would be a book that tracked what my family had been involved in. Now, they had so many fingers in so many dirty pies that it was actually an opportunity to write, a fair swathe of colonial history. But to write not as a series of historical subjects, but as a family saga, as a way of taking people through this complicated and often horrible material.
Yeah, no, that's true. And just touching on what Kate said, I mean, I come through that school system of the 50s and 60s. There was nothing for me as an Aboriginal kid to draw any inspiration from because we were absent from the school texts and the history books of that time period. And it's true, the only person I read about was Jackie Jackie, and he was a good black fella, protecting Kennedy as he was getting speared up in Queensland, and goodness knows what Kennedy had been doing up there to get speared.
I reckon somebody should do a study of Jackie Jackie because he was such a busy guy. He was simply everywhere and met a number of strange fates, but there was always Jackie Jackie. Actually, I can't sort of spiel them off now, but some of the names given to troopers, to Aboriginal workers, are very beautiful. Some of them are incredibly insulting, but some of them are actually very beautiful and look to real relationships between white and black, of amusement and regard, and that would be another great subject, the namings.
The great anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner, particularly with his ABC 1968 Boyer lecture After the Dreaming, which revealed the great Australian silence, did that impact onto you guys as in your younger years? I mean, Stanner's Boyer lecture?
Look, I'm ashamed to say I didn't hear them. They were 1968, weren't they? So I was 18, so I didn't hear them. But when I was researching the Secret River to try and find out what my convict ancestor had done, he was Solomon Wiseman, who started the ferry at Wiseman's Ferry, which a lot of you probably know quite well.
She still gets a small royalty for every car.
If only, David. His story was the classic, rags to riches in 2 generations. He made a fortune. all his children went bankrupt. So I'm afraid not a penny of it has filtered down. But where were we?
The Stanner.
Oh, Stanner, yeah. When I was researching to write the novel about him, I came across those Boyle lectures. They were piercing. It wasn't exactly new. In fact, in a way, the worst thing was it wasn't news. At some level, I had kind of always known it. And here was Stanner putting it into incredibly eloquent words and bringing it out so that I could see the full force of it. And I think, in a way, this book, Unsettled, for many drafts, it was called The Stories We Tell. And my book is not so much about the events or what happened as how we think about it and how we tell the stories, the actual words we use. So almost every page has me kind of deconstructing a little bit of English language. For example, the family story about Solomon Wiseman was that he went up the Hawkesbury and took up land. And when I thought with clearer brain about what took up actually means, it's a really cosy little thing, isn't it? Took up land, you take up a suggestion or a bit of unfinished knitting. It's a good thing to be doing. You're completing something that was unfinished.
You take up hobbies too, don't you?
You take up hobbies, yeah, that's
Took up
right.
woodworking.
So, that business of the language, the words we use, have served for the 200 and whatever it is years to obscure in the most effective way what we've done. So this book is really about me saying, okay, this is what I've learned, this is how I'm telling the story to myself. Let me pull it apart. Let me look at the actual words that I'm unthinkingly using and start to think about them.
Yeah. What about yourself, David, with Stanner and the Great Australian
Well,
Science?
Stanner is marvellous, and Stanner is true, and it really is one of those essays that changed the country. Yeah. But I want to challenge Stanner a bit, and these are the things you discover after you publish a book. Last year on Late Night Live, I interviewed a man who had written an extremely interesting history of the impact of empire on the British themselves. And in it, it became clear that there was something the world knew about, and the world included Australia, and I, thinking back to my childhood, I knew about this too. And that was the almost extermination of the Indigenous of Tasmania. That was a world story. And when the definition of genocide came to be determined, that is there described as a sort of an iconic genocide. Happened here, in this country, and we all knew about Tasmania. We grew up knowing about Tasmania. But we grew up thinking it was somehow only Tasmania, except for a few rumours we heard, a few whispers. And that is the peculiar subtlety of the forgetting, that a world-famous massacre occurred in Australia. And we always knew it, but we somehow said, that's just Tasmania.
Yeah, and as Lyndall Ryan's map has shown, there have been hundreds of massacres. The very prominent economic historian of the 1980s, Noel Butlin, he did a study, Our Original Aggression, which came out in 1983. Now, Butlin was one who said that, hypothesised that the Aboriginal population, he looked into it, in 1788 was over 1 million. Now, only 6 decades after the British arrived, that number had been reduced by somewhere between 60 to 90%. That's through violence and disease. And you remember, the Aboriginal population at the turn into the 20th century was 70,000. That shows the impact of that. That would be like dropping a number of atomic bombs on this country today and levelling the country out in many respects. So the impact of that. And that was the decimation level at that particular point in time.
Except that decimation means 1 in 10, and we're talking about 8 or 9 in 10.
That's true, yeah.
And we were, I mean, you say that we didn't know. Sorry, John. Just wanted to add one little thing that we didn't know. We kind of did, but we had terrific rationalisations and explanations. There was a sense that, it was all done by measles or the flu, nothing to do with us. Or that there was a kind of passivity or even a kind of weakness in Aboriginal people, that they had somehow kind of faded away. So we had these fabulous stories to explain what we did actually know.
Yeah.
Yes, that notion that as a weaker race they would inevitably die out.
Yeah, that was used.
Very strong in the 19th century, but it lingered.
Yeah.
It sort of lingered. And it was sort of, in a way, in an unhappy way, it was bolstered by the fact that most people living in cities in Australia tended to see Indigenous who were pretty wrecked. And they, extrapolated from those unhappy examples. Oh, yeah, it's all dying out. Smoothing the pillow. That hideous expression, will smooth the pillow.
Of a dying race.
Yes, that's right. David, your book delivers an insightful look into early Australian politics and the media, revealing flaws, manipulation, greed, power and control that was so rampant during those early years. Were you shocked by what you uncovered?
Look, I've worked for the National Times, and the criminality of Australian society can never truly shock somebody who spent, 8 or 10 years working for that very high-minded muckraking paper that I edited briefly. But I was, in a kind of strange way, delighted to discover what a bunch of crooks they all were. I mean, the colonies were just criminal cesspits. Yeah. Everybody was bilking everybody else. Nobody was paying their bills. Promises were broken left, right and centre. Doing business in the colony was something that you took your fortune in your hands to do. I mean, again and again there was... one of my sainted ancestors, it turns out, is one of the worst people that ever operated in the colony. And he was the paymaster of the rum corps. Yeah. And he made the soldiers take their wages in goods from his shop. And just the level of extortion, criminality, of commercial betrayal is really, really bracing. Yeah. And when you understand that what a kind of slovenly, dishonest, criminal enterprise most of the colony was, it puts into some sort of context the notion, the fact of people going out into the bush and being slovenly, criminal, heartless. It's not as though there were virtuous towns like Sydney. But they went out into the bush and became criminal murderers. It's all one. Yeah. The whole thing was crooked. Yeah.
No, it's amazing. And reading through that, I was shocked as you go through. I was actually wondering at one point, was Rupert News Corp already around?
Now that's the kind of cheap joke. No, but I naturally, as a journalist, I was fascinated by the contest between the newspapers. Yeah. And in particular fascinated and grateful for the fact that there were newspapers from the start, from the very start, who were saying we should not be doing this to those people. And on the other hand, there were newspapers, in particular the newspaper of a man I describe in the book as that great windbag of liberty, the newspaper of Mr. Wentworth, oddly enough called The Australian, of a vicious brutality towards the Indigenous that is shocking to read. And there was a war between the newspapers. And one of my sainted ancestors, by trickery, got control of one of those newspapers, the Sydney Gazette. And so there's a bit in the book about the extraordinary newspaper wars, there was a terrible problem for authorities in the early decades of the colony. The only good journalists were convicts. And they're the convicts, these convicts. Everybody would pretend that that person was not actually the editor. There would be somebody who was called the editor, but it was really edited by the convict on a ticket of leave. And those convicts would be lecturing the governor on good behaviour. It was actually a really blissful time.
Yeah. Kate, your family's journey winds from Sydney, the Hawkesbury, Wiseman's Ferry, the Hunter Valley, northern New South Wales, and then you undertook a road trip to retrace those journeys, family journeys. What are the surprises that you found in the stories that you uncovered?
Okay, look, the family stories, my family was mostly illiterate, so they left very little on the written record, unlike David's. So, for example, I've read everything about Solomon Wiseman, and on the subject of Aboriginal people, there is absolute silence, not a single word of any description of them. So I was kind of working in the dark there, but I knew some facts about him. I knew a tiny bit about the next generation. They settled at a place called Jerry's Plains up in the Hunter Valley. And that same man, when he went bankrupt in the 1840s, as so many did, he then retreated to a place called Currabubula, which some of you may have heard of. Anybody ever heard of Currabubula? Yeah, surprising numbers of people always know about Currabubula. It's up near Tamworth. And the family story is that he went to Currabubula and started the pub there. And that was certainly true. I went to the pub when I was researching various books. There in concrete above the pub is Davis Hotel. His name was John Martin Davis. So I was comforted by that because I thought, this is terrific. I knew enough about Australian history to know that the worst of the violence had been done by squatters out on the big spreads. And I thought, well, he probably wasn't fabulous. We're all complicit. Even if he just turned a blind eye, he was complicit. But at least he wasn't a squatter. And I reassured myself about that until in the last stages, yes, you know where the story's going, in the last stages of research, as I was actually almost as I was writing this book, I went to Trove one last time to look up the newspapers. I'm sure a lot of you know about Trove. What an incredible... We couldn't do any of this stuff without Trove, I don't think. We'd need research assistants.
Marvellous. Free of charge. Open
Brilliant.
to everybody.
We should
amazing thing.
We should all be volunteering to, turn the transcript into English. Anyway, there was something new in Trove that I hadn't discovered before. And long story short, I discovered that my ancestor, John Martin Davis, was not just a publican, limiting his footprint to the modest amount that a pub needed, and probably not in direct conflict with Aboriginal people over land. John Martin Davis was a publican. That part of the family story is true, but what it left out is that he was also a squatter. He had 25 square miles somewhere west of Currabubula. And that was a kind of searing... It served me right for having been so complacent about him being a publican. In another way, though, I felt a kind of... Now, this is weird, and it's an idea that's only just this minute coming to me. I also felt a kind of relief because I kind of knew that there must be worse things hidden in the family than any of the stories had ever told. And that uneasiness, that unsettled feeling about what I was doing here and what my family had done here, I could look it in the face. Here was the fact. He was a squatter. God knows what he did, but he gave to an Aboriginal man one of those things that are called king plates, a brass crescent, often inscribed, or usually inscribed, with the name of whoever the white people thought were the local leader. And the one that John Martin Davis is supposed to have given to a local man near Currabubula says, to Mr. Briney of Pialaway. Now, those king plates were interesting things. They were sometimes given as a mark of genuine respect, I believe, and some Aboriginal people wore them with some pride. But I think in many cases they were given as a kind of way of buying off the local people, flattering or attempting to flatter a leader so that he would influence his people not to be violent. The fact that John Martin Davis gave one of these king plates to a man on his land, the other man's land, told me that there must have been conflict. You wouldn't do something like that. You wouldn't give one if there were not trouble that you were trying to... So that's the biggest and most traumatic surprise, and it's still resonating. I think I'm still trying to process that.
Yeah.
Hey, just on king plates, I saw my first king plate when I was a university student, and I was a guest at a rather grand house down near Braidwood, and there was a king plate. There was a king plate hanging by the fireplace, and that was the first time I'd seen one. It was a local king plate. And I love the story that is in here of some people in the Moreton Bay area who demanded that their leader hand back his king plate, and he did.
Yeah.
I love that.
And we had no kings in this country, so that was a way of taking control of Aboriginal people and groups. And my grandfather, a very prominent early Aboriginal activist in the 1920s, who appears in this book, a bit of shameless self-promotion, in a letter to Premier Jack Lang, a 3-page letter to Jack Lang in 1927, in one part he said, at the time of invasion by the Europeans, the trade union movement, he said, were trying to attain the same conditions as existed in this country with Aboriginal people, namely that we had no king, we called no man master, and I've just forgot the whole sentence, a blank in my memory there. But that's the important. We didn't have any kings. It was a communal group that were in control of Aboriginal people at that particular point. Going back to a point you touched on earlier, David, boom and bust seems to be such a prevalent experience across the 19th century for many, including your own family. And I particularly loved a quote from Charles Darwin on his visit to Australia, that the whole population, rich and poor, are bent on accumulating wealth at any cost. Your thoughts? I mean, you have touched on this, but I thought it's a good one.
Charles Darwin's visit to Australia is phenomenally interesting. You know, apart from the fact that it was staring over Govet's Leap that kind of convinced him that the world was old, I love a lovely notion. He was a ferocious snob, and his view of Sydney was brilliantly horrible, and all written down in his diary. And he noticed one of the facts about Sydney that made it a really wretched town was that it didn't have enough bookshops. But he was, and he was taken out to, going up to the Blue Mountains. He paid a few pennies. He had a guide, of course, and for a few pennies, some of the local Indigenous threw boomerangs and spears, and this is all in his diary. It's, I mean, the visit of Darwin to Australia, the visit of Mark Twain to Australia, they're two really, really great things. But I was interested to see that nearly all of the first generation of settlers who took up land went broke. Yeah. It's the people who came in next who made their fortunes. There are many, many exceptions to this rule, of course. Families who, took up land like the Archers in Queensland, they're still there on a portion of the immense holdings they took up. But most people went bankrupt. They either went bankrupt because of the volatility of the wool trade or because they just didn't know how to deal with the land. And very often, particularly in northern Australia, they went bankrupt because they were trying to raise sheep in cattle country. The problem was that you couldn't make money with cattle. Until refrigeration came along, all the cattle could do would be to be sold off in local communities. Wool was so brilliantly, easily transportable that was the way you made money. Wool, then later gold, whaling, wool, gold. And all these people were going bankrupt. So one of my sainted ancestors, and I use the word sainted in the Pell sense, of course you all understand that George Pell in the afterlife has already performed his first miracle, which was to save the life of a little boy at a swimming pool. But let's not go there. Why did I even raise this? But one of my sainted ancestors went bust. He and a couple of his mates were trying to establish a closed shop of auctioneers in Sydney, and he went bust. Now, land in those days, and we're talking about the 1840s, early 1840s, land in those days was actually not worth very much because you didn't have title to it. Your money was in your sheep, and so he hid 25 or 30,000 sheep in the name of another of one of my sainted ancestors. And so when all of his creditors had been paid their 6 shillings in the pound, he emerged as a huge landowner in Queensland with those sheep. And this kind of commercial deception, just par for the course the entire time.
Yeah. Now, actually, just touching on Mark Twain, I couldn't help it. Coming from Newcastle, Twain commented at one of the longest main streets I've ever seen, at one end a gentleman's club and at the other end a cemetery.
He was the one who said that Australian history reads like beautiful lies.
Yes, absolutely.
God, he was onto it.
Yeah, he certainly was. It simply amazes me to see so many people continue to argue and deny an Aboriginal place in the history of the continent, particularly in relation to the history wars. Do you think the country will ever come to terms with its past?
Look, not if our leaders have anything to do with it, which is why I think it's up to us. This book, as I was writing it, I thought this is a kind of DIY, homemade truth-telling, and will hopefully lead on to other things for me, which it has. Look, we can only be optimistic because, as I heard Thomas Mayo say not long ago, you know, the history of Indigenous people is the history of being knocked back, knocked down, refused, but over the many years, with persistence, huge progress has been made. Yeah. Children no longer have to draw maps of explorers with Jackie. So that has to make you feel optimistic. And after all, 40% of us voted the right way on the referendum. Yeah. And my response, my feeling with this book, I have had a tsunami of emails from readers saying, thank you for kind of giving me a way to start thinking about this, not to kind of wallow in guilt, not to lose myself in the confusions of, well, okay, if I'm on stolen land, what do? I can't give it back. Instead of going into the morasses of those dead-end kind of paradoxes, to just go forward and say, all right, let's just get on with it right now with what I've got and sort of make some progress. There is huge hunger out there, and I think in a way, you know, if the referendum were run again today, I have a feeling there could be a different... We were kind of under a spell, the nation was under a toxic spell for a while there, and I have a feeling that although it doesn't look good in the short term, it did make people think, and I think people are now thinking differently. I hope so.
Yeah.
You're wrong, Kate. But we won't...
Put me right.
We won't go too much into the referendum. Look, yes, Australia will acknowledge. Because apart from anything, think back to school. Wasn't the Australian history we learned boring? Because invented histories always are. They're boring. When you put indigeneity into the history, it suddenly becomes interesting. And these stories and the real history of Australia is compellingly interesting. And that alone, I think, will drive the fact that, you know, I don't want to be unkind to the people as I look around this room because I'm one of them, but, you know, your grandchildren are learning a history of this country which is more truthful and more interesting. Alas, the study of history is a bit in decline at the moment. But yes, of course we will. We will absorb it. It makes sense. And in the end, I think we work towards making sense of our own position and our own and our past. Look, yes, there would be a different result for the referendum if both sides of politics supported it. But while the National Party continues to decide what the Liberal Party does, and for a blissful 48 hours there, I thought that might be over. The result of the referendum will be much the same.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment. And it's true. When you look at the 67 referendum with Holt and Whitlam, bipartisan support, 92% of the population nearly supported that referendum. If Dutton had backed at the Liberal Party, it would have got up. I mean, it completely torpedoed it.
It would have, but there's a big difference that we have to acknowledge between 67 and 23. In 67, what was being said was, you are as good as us, you are part of this country, and what's more, the Commonwealth Government is going to take responsibility for you away from boondock regimes like the Joh Bjelke-Petersen regime, or the Queensland, not Joh Bjelke-Petersen, but Queensland. You are one of us. It was an equality referendum. And the voice referendum was not an equality referendum. It was a referendum giving to Indigenous people a particular privilege. And that, I think, is always going to be very strongly contested in the politics of this country. There was another way of doing it, but that's not the way the referendum was, the 2023 referendum was done.
I think we could probably differ on that point greatly.
Yeah.
But, I mean, and the 67 referendum wasn't about, in essence, the Commonwealth Government taking over control. It was counting us in the census. And what flowed out of it was basically nothing. They broke up the control of the state protection boards, and there was no support for Aboriginal people and communities. There was no transition. We were completely set up to fail, and we're still suffering the repercussions, all these years later.
Oh, look, there's one other detail about the 67 referendum that I think people aren't aware of. The passing of control to the Commonwealth was very little talked about at the time, because one of the ways in which the then Country Party agreed to support the 67 referendum was a promise from Canberra that Canberra would never exercise its new powers. And one of the problems with Whitlam was, when he came along 5 years later, was he asserted for the first time the Commonwealth's ability to legislate for the Aboriginal people. And that was seen as a fundamental betrayal by Northern Australia. Fundamental betrayal. But that...
Well, we could go on talking about that, I'm sure, for the rest of the afternoon. But the story of the native police is one important story, and they were more like a paramilitary force than a police force. And it was interesting reading your book. If someone complained that they'd been menaced by the blacks, I mean, that could bring about a complete massacre of Aboriginal people mobilised. So it was these sort of things were happening, and there's so much of that in the book.
The mechanism was squatter feels menaced, or the squatter has lost shepherds. Many white men and women died on the frontier, and a squatter feels that things are getting tough, sends a messenger to the local native police camp. The native police camp doesn't get permission from anybody. That doesn't sort of, go down to Brisbane and, see if this is okay. They just go. They just go and carry out reprisal raids. The locals, the stockman on the property that is feeling menaced, joins the troopers. They were nearly always joint operations. And yes, they were paramilitary, and there was never any legal basis for them to operate. They were never actually authorised by legislation to do what they did. They were an informal paramilitary force at the beck and call of the settlers.
I mean, there's no question that there were non-Indigenous people who were killed on the frontier, but I mean, the numbers in comparison to what then was inflicted onto the Aboriginal population was staggering.
Oh yes, and Indigenous people understood that a dispute could be settled with a clash of some kind, but a clash of equals. What was devastating was the brutality of the white response to black violence. And that was the overwhelming wish to teach them a lesson. And of course, if you're teaching a lesson, you don't necessarily have to be revenging yourself on the people who actually did the harm. And it was the gross disproportion between the violence of the black and the violence of the white that's the fundamental story of the frontier wars.
Kate, I mean, it was the revelation. I mean, you did touch on this, that you were living on stolen land that set you off on the journey. Do you think you have resolved the dilemma for yourself as part of that journey?
No, I don't think so. I mean, in a way, my book starts where David's ends. David has gone into, in molecular detail, some of the horrors of the frontier. My question when I started thinking about all this was, yes, I kind of now know that. The next question is, what do we do? What do I do? And when I set off on this road trip, which took me from Wiseman's Ferry through all the places that the family story happened on, which ended up at Guyra, up in the so-called New England tablelands, as I did that, I went into it with no great intention. I didn't know what would happen. I just wanted to kind of open myself. I wanted to set up a triangle between myself here in the present, knowing the horrors, the kind of horrors that David has talked about. Another point in the triangle are the family stories that had come down to me and gave me what I felt very lucky to have, a way into the specifics of all that. And then the third one, of course, is the landscape and the people whose land it was and is. So I wanted to simply set up a kind of rotating tension between those three things, to plunge myself into it and just see what happened. So there was no intention, and in a way I came out of it with no great, there was no eureka moment, except perhaps at the Myall Creek Massacre Memorial, which is where I finished the book, because that was an act of kind of grassroots reconciliation, which gave me a sense that, there is a way forward if we're brave enough. The first thing is to look at the facts. The second is to think, to acknowledge your own personal connection with it as a non-Indigenous person. And then what the Myall Creek place... Have any of you been to the Myall Creek Memorial? A couple. I really recommend it. What it is a place where the best recorded massacre in Australia happened. There was a court case, so we know every detail of what happened, pretty much. It's near a little tiny town called Bingara. And in Bingara, in the year 2000, two groups of local people got together over somebody's kitchen table, descendants of the perpetrators of that massacre and descendants of the survivors. And the incredible, the unimaginable thing happened. They got together and they talked it through. And in there, they acknowledged what had happened, each side. I mean, you can imagine the rage and grief and sorrow on one side and the defensiveness and the sort of rationalisations on the other, or denial on the other. Somehow, over the table, a conversation was had, and then together they made this extraordinarily moving physical mark on the landscape which memorialises that moment. And they say this is an act of reconciliation. So I guess that's what I ended with. It kind of opens for me another question. Okay, I've now done that journey through my personal, and it was a confronting one, through my personal family history. But now I feel I have a responsibility to find out about the other things that come next, like, for example, treaty, which I've always kind of put in the too hard basket. That's for other people to organise. And maybe that's true, but now I feel one way forward is to continue to be informed about stuff like that. Learn about it. Take it in, contradictory and confusing though it may be.
Yeah. David, were there any signs of remorse in the records of your ancestors with Aboriginal people? What happened, what they did?
Okay, yes, there was a bit. So the whole reason that lot came to Australia was because a very rich Sydney merchant called Richard Jones married, for reasons we cannot really work out, a poor girl from the Thameside slums. And he then looked after her many brothers, and they all came. He brought them all out to Australia as they became young teenagers, put them to work, and later on, he was one of the founders of the King's School, and a couple of the last of these slum kids he sent to King's. Oddly enough, not a celebrated family in the history of the King's School. But this man was responsible for them all coming out. And he was a mega Christian. And he was one of the founders of the Benevolent Society, which still exists. The Benevolent Society did nothing whatever for any black in Sydney. That was all for the whites. If you were poor, drunk, indigent, etc., 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 you could find shelter and comfort at the Benevolent Society if you were white. He was also a great advocate of not unnecessarily provoking the Aboriginal people. And in that, I mean, he is to be honoured because he was one of those who, for instance, when he came to control the Sydney Gazette, he was one of those who vehemently attacked the violence at Mile Creek. But he nevertheless had a fundamental view, despite his rhetoric of care and concern, that the land was his for the taking. And that required the land to be then profitably worked. And if that required harsh treatment of the local Indigenous people, then that had to happen. Now, this is, I think, what makes this one of the reasons that I find this so compellingly fascinating as a subject is the ways in which that was all rationalised and rationalised by Christians. It is perhaps not news to you that the Anglican established church was utterly fucking hopeless about Aboriginal people. Bishop Broughton was one of the members of what has been many times described as the greatest whitewash in Australian history, which was the 1830 inquiry into deaths in then Van Diemen's Land. It was absolutely horrible. The Catholic Church was a little bit better, but not hugely better. This is a story of the small faiths, in particular the Congregationalists. They were wonderful. Congregationalist journalists, editors, and missionaries. Presbyterians, good as well, and some of them marvellous, like Lang. And the Quakers. Honest to God, there were two Quakers who travelled through Australia, through the colonies in the 1830s, reported to Governor Burke, if you keep taking this land, there's going to be violence. Their findings on what they saw read as if they were written yesterday. They are so good. But in my family, it's not as though there were documents left behind showing extraordinary grief. There was nuanced views. And of course, as in so many families, there was a bonfire. And the bonfire of documents in the Ewer family happened in about 1910. And so we lost an immense amount at that point.
Maybe another follow-up book on the religion And the
Oh,
church.
there's a fair amount about the religion and the church in there.
Yeah. But look, just to touch on too, the commemoration of the Mile Creek Massacre is next weekend. I've been invited up there to attend that commemoration. We have hundreds of people attend that event every year from right across the country. I gave the keynote address there 10 years ago and they've asked me to come back up. But look, we've reached the point we should end now and open up to some questions. I don't know if people have got a microphone out there. Yep.
There are runners with mics.
Yeah, there's runners with mics.
G'day. Thanks, all three. Can I, a couple of questions for David, but I'll just, if I may, augment John's recollection of the Mark Twain quote about Newcastle. It was made in the context that the cemetery had been emptied to make way for the railway line.
Which is a pattern all around Australia. Central Station in Sydney was a graveyard. Yep.
So the quote was that Newcastle has the longest main street. At one end is a cemetery with no bodies, and the other a gentleman's club with no gentlemen.
True. Yeah.
So, David, one quick question. The name of and author of the book you mentioned about the impact of the empire upon the British, I'd love to know that. And secondly, your distinction between conquest and stealth. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Look, I can't remember the author's name at the moment. I'm 77 years old, and it was a very unfair question. It was a brilliant question.
I've forgotten already.
But I can find it for you. Look, this is what you touch on there is a very serious question. What metaphor are we going to use? Are we going to use the metaphor of theft or the metaphor of war? Because those two metaphors don't go together in this story. And if it's a metaphor of war, then that dignifies both sides. If it's a metaphor of theft, then that absolutely damns the non-Indigenous side as criminals. Now, this is a story replete with criminality at every level. But if we are thinking of this as war, then we have to view the white side through a slightly different filter. This was a war of conquest, and both sides had their strategies, their aims, etc., etc. Now, we know who won, but I think, I don't know where I am on this, but I think we do have to wonder which is the appropriate metaphor. If we want, as I very badly want, this fighting to be commemorated properly in the War Memorial in Canberra, the War Memorial in Canberra doesn't celebrate thieves. It celebrates warriors and war and mourns war. So the business of the metaphor, I think, is very unfinished at the moment.
Other questions?
Kate, you mentioned that your book has touched off some searching that you're planning, some more activities. Can you mention what they are, what your plans are now? Thanks.
Yes, I'm continuing to realise how important it is to go to a place. I was saying last night that somebody told me that there had possibly been a massacre at Mount Pleasant, which I'm sure you all know, at Saratoga. And so yesterday I went up there just to see what the country was, what it was like, just to look at it. And it is an extraordinary place, and you can absolutely see how it would have been very easy to trap people there. So my consciousness that actually being on the place tells you volumes that you didn't expect to learn. You think, oh yeah, I can see it on the map, I've heard the stories, I know what it is. But to actually be standing there, that's something that I'm taking away from that. The other thing, of course, is to get informed about things like treaty that have always seemed too hard, to continue, the necessary education. You can fill in some gaps, but you need to keep going forward and talking to people and listening.
How extraordinary it is to go to the place. How extraordinary. And I found going to the places where my family had land, places where there were massacres, sometimes the land just didn't speak at all. And that I found overwhelming. You know, this is a stretch of country. Speak to me. For Christ's sake, speak to me. And what I realised was that I was looking for a spot. And this is the spot where the massacre happened. And apart from Mile Creek, which is wonderful, there are very, very few spots in Australia where they can say, this is where it happened. And then I realised that the memorial is the whole landscape. It's the whole landscape. And that was something I found very powerful in Rachel Perkins' series, television series, was it last year or the year before, where she showed the whole landscape mourning, just not the place.
It's very important to visualise and be in that space. I remember something like 20 years ago, someone from the other side of the university contacted me. One of their students was doing a PhD on the missionary Threlkeld, who was an extraordinary individual.
He's a hero.
Absolute hero. And they said, look, can you point the student into the direction of archives that they can look at? I said, I can do that, but tell your student first off to go out to Belmont and Warners Bay and Toronto, where Threlkeld's missions were, and just sit there and visualise the landscape of where things took place. It's so very important to take that step.
Oh, look at Threlkeld. He's just magnificent. He was he was a dissenting clergyman. He was sent out by the London Missionary Society. He had this splendid task. He was going to translate the Gospel of St. Luke,
which he did,
into Awabakal, and he had as his intermediary a young man who had been taken away as a servant with the military. He was therefore absolutely fluent in English, and this man was his gatherer of information about killings in the Hunter Valley. And Threlkeld Threlkeld would then go and investigate what he had heard, and then he would denounce, then he would inform the Attorney General. And there were even a couple of prosecutions because of he was a wonderful, wonderful man.
Yeah, Birrabam was the man. I mean, a fully initiated Aboriginal man as an adult as well. And I think that's really important. That Threlkeld was the pen, but Birrabam was the voice, you know, informing Threlkeld of all of these things that were happening, and certainly aspects of Aboriginal culture and language and history. It was all there for Threlkeld, who absorbed it, you know, so outstanding. We've got to wrap it up? All right. Okay. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming along. Okay.